Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome. Access to Democracy returns. And we have a returning guest, Chuck Samuelson. He's wearing a dark suit today because he is still mourning the Syracuse loss in the Final Four. He's an inveterate Syracusan, as am I, but Chuck's more of a fan of Syracuse than I am today.
I only watch Syracuse basketball, and I only watch it in March and April, which means I watch basketball every year.
Well, they actually made a bowl game in football this year.
Yeah, but I don't watch football.
Oh, okay. The ACLU, everybody hears about it. It's venerated. It's despised. Explain what the Civil Liberties Union does.
The Civil Liberties Union protects the civil liberties of people in the United States. The Minnesota Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU of Minnesota, protects the Civil Liberties Union, or the civil liberties of people in Minnesota. We're sort of the franchise for this state. So we do three things. We lobby, we educate, and we litigate.
And litigate you do on more than one occasion. You were very active last year on the two amendments, the two proposed amendments, both of which fortunately went down.
Yes. We did a lot of work on both amendments. We did a lot of work legally to make sure that the proper forms were followed and that the proper language was used. We weren't successful in that, and we also were one of the leaders in organizing the opposition to both amendments.
And you were successful in that, and they both were voted down by
That's
the people.
right. And the voting amendment we're particularly pleased with because when that was introduced, 80% of the electorate in Minnesota thought that it appeared to be a good idea. When the votes were tallied, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 45% of the electorate in Minnesota thought it was a good idea.
Which meant that a good job was done.
They changed. It is the biggest upset in Minnesota political history.
Now, one of the things about the ACLU, people say, they work with the Democrats. But the fact of the matter is that the ACLU works with everybody. The ACLU protected, on occasions, members of the KKK in the South. The ACLU protected the right of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois some years ago.
Cost 20% of our membership.
It cost you 20%.
20% of the
and
members
people
quit.
don't understand that your job is to protect civil liberties. It's not a partisan situation.
No, we are political. We are political but nonpartisan. I think that's important to point out. And you can say, well, the ACLU is a Democratic group, and you know, we support the Democrats when the Republicans are in power, and we are supporting the Republicans when the Democrats are in power. Fundamentally, every party is majoritarian, and the Constitution protects the rights of the minority from the tyranny of the majority. So if you're protecting people's constitutional rights, definitionally, you have to be on the side of the minority.
Now, interestingly enough, under this Supreme Court, and I'm talking about the U.S. Supreme Court, constitutional rights, particularly under the Bill of Rights, have been eroded, in my opinion, rather sharply, particularly Fourth Amendment rights.
Well, I'd have to say yes or no. Yes and no, rather. The Fourth Amendment, which controls things like privacy and your the search warrant requirements and sort of how police can investigate you in general. Under this Supreme Court, the court, Scalia in particular, has been very good at not allowing police to use new technologies to spy on you, for example.
In fact, in a very recent decision.
And on the infrared cameras for to spot these grow houses, you know.
Yeah.
At the same time, they've been terrible on the war on drugs in other areas. They are very weak on privacy, and they tend to be very supportive of corporate rights, as opposed to individual, real people rights.
I think history will show that the Roberts Court is the most corporative, supportive Supreme Court that we have seen, certainly within the last 100 years.
Yeah, I think I would say certainly since Roosevelt's attempted packing of the Supreme Court in the early 1930s. After that, I think this is clearly the most corporate-friendly Supreme Court. Prior to that, you could make an argument that some of the ones in the 20s and the 30s of the last century were very...
Well, this is the court that said that a corporation is a person. And only recently I heard that there's a corporation having a baby. But maybe that's erroneous.
I think that's probably just on some video that you can't talk about.
Okay. Well, one of the things that we talked about very briefly before you came on was drone, I don't know what you call it, intrusion, drone warfare. Now we have a city, a small city in Minnesota that just recently passed an ordinance that said drones can't fly over our city.
St. Bonifacius, population probably 1,000. No, but
are they putting in any aircraft guns or just?
I don't know. I think I'm not quite sure, and it's probably I would venture to say it's probably against the law to shoot down a drone.
I suspect it is.
I'm throwing it out there because I think drone season doesn't exist. It's not like geese or ducks.
Although if you use a weapon under the Second Amendment, it may not be, because it seems that everybody's entitled to have all sorts of weapons under the Second Amendment. So maybe.
Well, we could do a whole program on the Second Amendment, and I would ask everybody to read the entire Second Amendment,
which takes about 30 seconds.
Right, and not just the back half of the Second Amendment, which takes about 15 seconds. To get back to drones, though, they are part of a very disturbing trend that's been going on, frankly, since the Reagan administration, almost without let-up, under the Clinton administration and under the Obama administration.
In fact, it's proliferating under Obama.
I think we're seeing the effects of it more under Obama. I think that this is simply the end game of what had been running up under the Bush administration. Remember that every president is imperial or wants to be imperial. Some, like Jimmy Carter, are particularly unsuccessful at it, despite the fact that they try. And
George W. Bush said, "Did you say inferior?" And you said, "No, imperial."
Imperial, that's right. Yeah. No, inferior. That's partisan. We're political. And partly what's happened is, again, this war on drugs and this war on immigration. These war metaphors have been, I think, an excuse to use military technology, these drones, on the United States. Now, the ACLU has been suing the Obama administration. In fact, we've filed more lawsuits against Obama than we did under Bush. We filed a lot of suits on Guantanamo and other places and other situations like that regarding rendition and things, but it's the drones, and more particularly the way they're used. Not only is it bad enough that the federal government is using drones, and the local governments, local sheriff's departments, including the sheriff in Clay County, Minnesota, which is where Moorhead is, have drones that they use just to spy on people. But the military also uses these drones under presidential orders to kill American citizens abroad. Now, these are not American citizens whose opinions I agree with, or you would agree with, or probably any of your viewers would agree with. But I would ask people to consider whether or not that is justification enough for simply killing them while they're driving in their car in some foreign country.
See, I would take it a step further also. What right do we have to kill any citizens overseas where we're not in a declared war? And we just had an incident this week where there was an Al-Qaeda chieftain and they spotted him with a drone and they killed him.
Right.
Well, they killed 8 little kids at the same time. Collateral damage, I don't buy that. I think that it's absolutely antagonistic to everything that we should believe in.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I think that frankly, this is a war of ideas. And we've been engaged in this war of ideas for a long time, decades. And the thing is that when you fight a war, there are casualties, and in a war of ideas against a non-state actor like Al-Qaeda or any of the Hamas or any of these other groups, or, frankly, the Ku Klux Klan or the Aryan Brotherhood or any of these groups, these are non-state actors. The trouble is we have a state actor to state actor framework to act in, and so they act that way. But when you deal with non-state actors, it's a war of ideas, and we have the better ideas. We need to live those ideas, and it will be painful to us to live those ideas, but that's the only way we can ultimately win. The trouble we have, in the Middle East is compounded by, historically, we've supported dictators in order to ensure a supply of oil, or we've supported the Israeli government past the bounds of where they were before, and we have basically allowed things to happen that have discriminated against the majority of the people who live in proximity to Israel. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, what should we have done, and what can we do to make amends, and how can we change things, how can we behave differently? These are all political questions that have to be asked. But we need to say to ourselves, what is it that makes America special? If you are, like the Republicans believe, a country that is of a special country, then you need to hold yourself up and to a higher standard than other people. And if you're not willing to hold yourself up to a higher standard, then you cannot make the argument that somehow we are special. And that's the conundrum that the Obama administration finds itself in, and the Bush administration before it. I mean, do we have some, frankly, God-given or extra power-given right to invade other countries willy-nilly? I give you Afghanistan or Iraq.
Well, the Republicans would probably say, look in the Bible and you'll find it, but I look and I haven't found it.
Well, I would be interested to see where the Constitution allows you to do that, because the First Amendment expressly says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that's the tension we live in on that issue.
And free speech also
Right.
in the First Amendment. And we've seen free speech really, really targeted in so many respects. As a matter of fact, just recently, 2 people were thrown out of a concert because of descriptions that they had on their T-shirts. And I don't know if it's a case that the ACLU was involved in, not in this state, it was someplace else. But that has happened in the past.
Sure.
Where you express an opinion, or even where you curse on your T-shirt, and it ends up with you ending up in jail.
I don't know of anybody ending up in jail, but I do know that people get removed from private venues. So if, for example, Shone Productions is going to have a concert of, I don't know, Iggy Doo-Bop or something, and you have a T-shirt that says Iggy Doo-Bop is a child molester, and they ask you to leave, they have every right to do that. But if the federal government is paying for this particular thing, whatever the event is, and the president's coming, and you've got a T-shirt that says President Bush is a jerk, they can't deny you entrance to that thing, and they can't force you to leave.
But they did
Of course they did.
under the Bush administration,
Of
and I
course.
think they have done similar things
Under
under the
every
Obama
president. Under every
administration.
president. We sued the federal government, I think, 7 or 8 times, and the state, the Minnesota government, and the Ramsey County sheriffs, 7 or 8 times regarding the GOP convention when it was here in '08. And we finally settled, and this is something people need to appreciate. We settled the last one in 2012, 4 years later, and that one was a case where the sheriff took protest materials that he didn't like, and he just confiscated them and wouldn't give them back because he said this stuff's garbage and it shouldn't be seen. Now, the courts
Again,
did say...
First Amendment.
Right, and the courts did say, well, you have to give it back 4 years later. And so you see a lot of this kind of preemptive...
Which is a little late for the 2008 convention.
That would be my point.
Yeah.
And I think you see a lot of that, and I think you see a lot of the government doing things like that, saying, oh, well, we don't really care if we win the case. We're going to shut them up when the spotlight's on them, and then we'll take care of it when the spotlight's gone.
We saw it last year with Occupy Minnesota.
Yes, we did. And we defended them. 2 or 3 cases with Occupy Minnesota we represented.
I mean, there's a question when you go on to grounds that are clearly forbidden grounds, but if it's public grounds, what's forbidden?
Well, if it's public grounds that are used for corporate events that benefit the county or for which, that the county likes, then you can't ban people that the county doesn't like having events that the county wishes weren't there. I mean, it is as the old saying goes, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and these are public spaces, and you can't discriminate on viewpoint.
Now, we are losing at the end of May a Republican-appointed judge by the name of Paul Anderson.
Correct.
Who actually was Arnie Carlson's campaign manager and ultimately worked his way up from the Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court.
He was Arnie Carlson's attorney that got Arnie Carlson on the ballot to beat Perpich back in 90.
Whatever that was, yeah. Paul Anderson, to me, is one of the really true civil libertarians that we have had in this state. I think his loss, notwithstanding the fact that he's going to be replaced by somebody who is really well qualified, David Lillehog, who will probably be on here in the fall. I think that the loss of Paul Anderson is a real loss to this state.
I couldn't agree more. I think that Paul Anderson has focused on the rights of the individual versus the right of the collective, no matter who's running the collective, Democrat or Republican. I think that, and I think that he's been unafraid to make his comments and to make them powerfully and succinctly.
And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is you recently brought a case, the ACLU, against police officer in Gaylord, Minnesota, on profiling Latinos. Do you want to talk about that?
We recently brought a case against the city of Gaylord and the police department of Gaylord because they arrested a Hispanic woman who was here legally and had all the proper documentation. They arrested her and held her because they didn't believe her. And then they searched her house without a warrant and found out that she was telling the truth and she did have the proper papers. I would ask your listeners, when you leave your home to go to your job, or when you leave your home to go for a walk, or when you leave your home to go to the grocery store, do you have all your documentation that proves that you're a U.S. citizen? Could you prove that you're a U.S. citizen? Even if you were born here, even if your parents were born here and you were born here, even if your grandparents were born here and your parents were born here and you were born here, and the answer is probably not. Oh, you'll have a driver's license. That does not prove you're a citizen. And, will you have a voter ID card or a voter registration card? Maybe, probably not, though. I mean,
Walk around with your passport.
Exactly. Get a passport first and then walk around with it all the time. Otherwise, the police should be able to arrest you and throw you in jail saying, no, you're really from some other country.
Which is, obviously, I didn't know about the search. That makes compounding of what they did in the first place.
Yes.
In the second place.
Yes.
Searching without a warrant, yes. But isn't it a fact that about 20% of Gaylord is Hispanic or Latino, and this particular officer made about 50%? He would sit outside.
60%.
60%.
He would sit out. He sits outside the Waldbaum Egg Factory. Those of you who buy eggs that say Crystal Farms, they come from Gaylord, from this facility in Gaylord. And there are a significant number of Latinos who work there. Now, before you jump up and down and say, oh, they're just exploiting them and so forth and so on, I'm not going to defend the hiring policies of any corporation. I don't think that Crystal Farms is any better or worse than any other corporation. They're going to hire people that they can do the job at a price they want to pay. But Crystal Farms, I'm sure, does all the things that are required to do under law to determine whether or not these people have an ability to work there. Crystal Farms pays the people. These people work. They're good workers, and they make a good product.
And they're in the country legally.
That's my assumption because Crystal Farms hired them, or Waldbaum Eggs, which is the division of Crystal Farms. The thing is that there are not enough workers in greater Minnesota. The dirty little secret is that the young people leave these rural communities in droves and they come to Minneapolis, St. Paul, to the Twin Cities. That's why our population is growing. And they come not just from greater Minnesota, but from Iowa and the Dakotas and western Wisconsin as well. And they come from small towns to the big city. Now, this has been going on, by the way, for 200 years. This is not new news. Kids have left the farm to go to the big city since there were big cities. And I think that we need to understand that if you want to have the fruits of the soil in your refrigerator in the Twin Cities, somebody's got to process them. Somebody's got to put those eggs in a cardboard carton and pack them in a truck to send them to Cub or wherever.
And you don't need a cop sitting outside the door just looking at the complexion of people, then pulling them over, which is what this particular officer did. And
60% of the people this guy stopped were Hispanics, and of all the cases that he stopped, more than a third of them were thrown out by the court because they were so egregious.
And the rest maybe were minor traffic infractions or something like that.
And the rest, some got convicted and some didn't. We're talking the ones that the judge said, "Are you kidding? Get this out of here." And his rate of getting cases thrown out was more than twice as much as the rate of the next other of the cops in Gaylord. This is a tale not particular to Gaylord, except that we happen to have spent time along with the students from from Gustavus Adolphus in St. Peter, Minnesota, who spent time doing traffic studies, who spent time documenting the arrest, who spent time going over the videotapes, and basically the ACLU pays 25 cents a page for all the documentation, which, trust me, is a hernia-producing amount of paper at 25 cents a page.
No, already we didn't get to a lot of things I wanted to talk about, but we have a couple minutes left about immigration and what the Civil Liberties Union is doing in the immigration story. I mean, there are those people, as Romney said in the last campaign, voluntarily leave. 12 million people voluntarily leave. There have seemed to be some steps, intelligent steps taken recently, which indicate that maybe we can recognize that people who have been in this country, particularly children of people who have been in this country, possibly illegally, should not be thrown out of the country.
Well, we got a couple minutes, and I'm just going to kind of hit the high points. This country, especially in the agricultural area, the workforce has been primarily Hispanic, primarily coming from Mexico, although some from other South American countries, through Mexico, for at least the last 50 years. Cesar Chavez and his unions in California, the lettuce and the grapes, those people were illegal, quote-unquote, immigrants, although they weren't at the time. What they were what we called migrant workers. So they would live in Mexico and they would follow the crops north, and then they would harvest them, but going, at the end of the year, and then they'd live in Mexico and come back and do it again the next year. Not a perfect system, but when we decided that we were going to shut our borders down, we trapped tens of millions of illegals now, because we simply dropped the line and anybody over, after this date was here illegally, with no way to become citizens. This in a country that is nothing but immigrants, except for Native Americans, which is 0.7% of the population.
Native Americans whose country we took, and we put them on reservations. We have broken treaties dozens of times and relegated them to the status of third-class citizens.
Clearly. But my point is that 99.3% of everybody else of everyone in this country is an immigrant or the descendant of immigrants. And yet, we've now, and this did not start except in the last 100 years, where we would have quotas from certain countries, clearly racially biased quotas. And we would have enforcement that was clearly racially biased. And yet, you can't eat food, whether it's in a restaurant or out of your kitchen, that has not had workers from a foreign country, many of whom are not here with the proper documentation, make that possible for you to eat. And we're perfectly okay with that.
Well,
no, we're perfectly okay with it.
We are okay with it, but the government, quote unquote, does not seem to be okay with it. Or
we're just schizophrenic about it. We're perfectly okay paying the prices. We just don't want to have to acknowledge that these people exist, and so we treat them as fifth-class citizens, and that's simply un-American. And the rights that the civil liberties that you and I have in this country come from the fact that we are in this country, not because we are citizens of this country, except for one, and that's voting. So we have the power to make change or to maintain the status quo if we choose to use it.
And if people stop listening to sound bites and start getting involved, if people dedicate themselves to living by what the Constitution provides and not what they envision that it provides, Second Amendment being a perfect example of that.
Well, I think clearly it's time for us as a society to stop bowling alone. I think it's time for us to sit down and talk to our neighbors, especially talking to the people who disagree with us, and especially talking to the people who not only disagree with us, but who don't look like us. That's what we've got to do. That's our job.
And the fact of the matter is, 50 years from now, the complexion of this country is going to be changed. Whether rednecks like it or not, it's a fact of life. We haven't even talked about the attack on gays and how that has turned the corner, equal marriage. But what we have done is run out of time. It's always an education to have Chuck Samuels here from the ACLU of Minnesota, and to be continued. Thank you.
Alan, thank you.